Our presenter today, Dr. Yulia Richard. Dr. Yulia Richard holds a professional doctorate in clinical and health psychology, with postgraduate qualifications in psychology, counseling and psychotherapy, and applied psychology. She is an associate member of the Australian Psychological Society, a member of the Australian Clinical Psychology Association, and a committee member of the APS Interest Group for Culture and Psychology. Her clinical and research interests include developmental issues, well-being, stress and anxiety, relationships and conflict resolution, grief and loss, culture and psychology, health psychology, emotional intelligence, and organizational psychology. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Yulia Richard.
Welcome everyone. My name is Yulia Richard and I'm a clinical psychologist from Blue Horizon Counseling and Mediation. And like so many of you, I have spent years trying to balance demanding practice, advanced studies, and raising young children all at once. And I know what it feels like to run on empty. And this journey is exactly why I'm so passionate about this work and why I'm so dedicated to share this insight with you. My goal is to ensure that as helping professionals, we are not just surviving our careers, but actually thriving them for the long haul. To give you an overview of today's session, we are going to look at burnout not simply as a stress or exhaustion, but as a gradual shift in the way the brain, body, emotions, and nervous system function under prolonged overload. We are going to explore why burnout develops slowly and why so many people don't recognize it until they are already significantly depleted, and why the rest alone often doesn't fully resolve it. We are going to examine as well an important paradox. The same qualities that often make people highly effective, such as empathy, responsibility, persistence, emotional investment, and high standards, can also become the very factors that increase vulnerability to burnout under chronic strain. And finally, we are going to begin to look beyond the individual alone, because burnout rarely exists in isolation. From the environments people function within, we are going to look more closely and start to see the role of a system, workload, emotional exposure, and the absence of genuine recovery underneath it. So specifically, we are going to look at this content together. You can see it on your screen. So from introduction, we are going to look at signs and symptoms and stages of burnout. We are going to look at the differences between burnout, stress, anxiety, and depression, psychological dimensions and theories of burnout, cognitive, somatic, and other functions of burnout. We're going to look at risk factors and psychological burden in our particular professions. We are going to have a few case studies to reflect on. We are going to look as well at the differences of prevention and intervention and the measurement tools. And I would like you to picture a moment that might feel incredibly familiar to so many of you. So you finally stopped at the end of the day and your last session is over. The email slowed down, and for the first time in hours, no one immediately needs anything from you. But your body doesn't get the memo, and your mind keeps on scanning, replaying a specific conversation, ticking off what you've missed, or already preparing for tomorrow's sessions before today has even finished. For so many of us, this constant state of alert becomes so familiar that we stop recognizing it as stress. It just feels like life itself. It feels like the baseline cost of caring. Rest stops being restorative. It just becomes a brief pause between the demands. And quietly, beneath the surface, things begin to shift. You find yourself more emotionally depleted, cognitively overloaded, and slightly detached. You become more reactive and less present, and unable to bounce back the way you used to. But this is not just a sign that you're not handling your workload well, or that you just need to manage your time or your task better. The reality is that no matter how resilient you are, staying in overdrive for too long naturally overrides our capacity to rest and reset. And today, we are going to look at actually what happens when a person under constant state of alert slowly begins to feel as if it's their new normal. Before we are going to move into research and theoretical models, I want to briefly ground this in your personal experience. I'm inviting you all to reflect honestly on your own experiences and to see if any of these questions resonate with you. Do you find it difficult to fully switch off, even when the workday is technically over? Do small demands lately feel more overwhelming or heavier than they used to? Have you become more emotionally reactive, detached, cynical, or numb? Do you feel emotionally exhausted even after you had a brief rest? And have you noticed difficulties concentrating, remembering information, or switching off properly? And do you feel like functioning but not truly recovering? And the last one, have you started moving through responsibilities more automatically, but feeling less connected to them? There are some of more common indicators that burnout may already play a role in someone's life, and you will often see these patterns not only in yourselves, but in your clients as well. And just out of curiosity, how many of you actually experience burnout at some point in your life? Feel free just to raise an emoji or raise a reaction. Okay, so if these patterns feel deeply personal, it is because they are part of massive shared reality. Latest broad workforce survey consistently indicates that between 40 and 80% of workers globally are currently struggling with burnout symptoms. While it might feel as a global epidemic, the impact is not distributed equally. And when we look at large job-level database, burnout risk heavily cluster in roles characterized by high emotional load and constant crises. The absolute highest rates of burnout belong to healthcare and helping professionals. Hospital nurses lead globally with around almost 7% experiencing acute burnout at any given moment, closely followed by emergency physicians, primary care doctors, and child and family social workers. And where do we see it as mental health practitioners? The data for our own field is concerning. Broad professional summaries shows that over 50% of psychotherapists report moderate to high levels of burnout, with emotional exhaustion leading the charge. And in fact, a recent international survey found that over a quarter of practicing psychologists meet criteria for probable work burnout. On the flip side, looking at the professions with the lowest burnout rates, such as technical writers, user experience designers, data analysts, who all sit under 1%, it tells us exactly what we are missing. When you study these low-risk fields, their protective features are not a secret. They have low exposure to trauma, minimal emotional crises, and clear boundaries with fewer unpredictable emergencies. They involve complex cognitive work, but without continuous high-stakes caretaking. So for us, caretaking is the work. And seeing this makes it undeniable. We are absorbing the strain of a depleted society, and our industry data actually reflecting this toll. So we are clearly not looking at isolated or individual issues here. We are looking at a systemic pattern that has become deeply embedded into modern work, caregiving, and high responsibility environments. This widespread impact brings us to a crucial question that will guide us for the rest of our session today. What exactly is burnout, and how do we begin clinically deconstructing it? Let's take a look at foundational concepts of burnout. The term burnout was first introduced in 1970s by psychologist Herbert Freudenberger. And while operating within a community mental health clinic, Freudenberger began to notice a specific recurrent trajectory among highly committed professionals and volunteers. These were clinicians who started out deeply invested in helping others, but over time, they gradually drifted into a state of profound emotional exhaustion, physical depletion, and psychological disengagement. And what made Freudenberger's observation so important was that the individuals didn't lack motivation or competence. In fact, these patterns occurred in people who were highly capable, deeply responsible, and completely dedicated to their work. Some of specific behavioral markers he tracked are highlighted on the slide you can see on your computers. Following Freudenberger's initial observation, the syndrome was systematically conceptualized through the empirical research of Christina Maslach and her colleagues. They established that burnout is a specific psychological response to chronic, long-term exposure to interpersonal and occupational stress. So now the ICD-11 defines burnout as an occupational phenomenon resulting from a chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. To meet framework's criteria, the syndrome must manifest across 3 distinct dimensions, which you can see on your slide. We have energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental state distance or cynicism, and reduced professional efficacy. So let's take a look at the most commonly used measurement tools for burnout. So the first one we are going to take a look at is Maslach Burnout Inventory, MBI. And MBI was the first standardized, widely used measure of occupational burnout and remains the reference point for the field. It conceptualizes burnout as a syndrome of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization or cynicism, and reduced personal accomplishment with separate subscale for each rather than a single total score. So the standard 22-item MBI uses a 7-point frequency scale and yields 3 scores: emotional exhaustions, depersonalizations, and personal accomplishment. Higher emotional exhaustion and depersonalization scores and lower personal accomplishment scores indicate more severe burnout, and contemporary manual treats these dimensions as a continuous rather than binary burnt out or not burnt out diagnosis. So the next one is Copenhagen Burnout Inventory, or CBI. The Copenhagen Burnout Inventory reframes burnout primarily as exhaustion and fatigue, explicitly anchored to the sources of stress: personal life, work, and client or patient exhaustion. It was designed as an open license alternative to the MBI, addressing both cost and conceptual concerns, and it is frequently referred to simply as Copenhagen Burnout Tool. So the CBI uses 19 items across 3 subscales: personal burnout, work-related burnout, and client-related burnout. So respondents rate frequency or intensity of fatigue and exhaustion on a simple response options that are converted into score. Always 100, often 75, sometimes 50, and seldom 25, and never 0, generating easily interpretable percentage for each domain. Conceptually, CBI makes 2 key moves. It focuses on fatigue and exhaustion as the essence of burnout and distinguishes between different life domains as the origins of that exhaustion. This addresses some criticism of the MBI by decoupling burnout from attitudinal components, such as cynicism and perceived accomplishments, and by making explicit whether burnout is primarily driven by work conditions, personal life stresses, or intensive client or patient contact. And the tools that we frequently use in our practice is Burnout Assessment Tool. The BAT is a more recent instrument recently developed to operationalize burnout as a unified syndrome comprising of 4 dimensions: exhaustion, mental distancing, cognitive impairment, and emotional impairment. It was explicitly designed as a state-of-the-art successor to the older tools, aligning more closely with the contemporary definition of burnout, including the ICD-11 focus on the chronic work-related stress. In the BUT framework, exhaustion is still central, but it is embedded in a broader pattern of symptoms that include psychological withdrawal or mental distancing from work, functional impairment, cognitive and emotional, and this makes it particularly suitable when you want to capture how burnout manifests in day-to-day functioning, such as concentration problems, emotional blunting, or affective instability, which are highly relevant in clinical and safety-sensitive contexts like healthcare. But psychometric scores only tell us a part of a story. What does this actually look like when you walk into your practice tomorrow morning? How do these numbers translate into the way we actually think, feel, and show up? Let's take a look now at the signs and symptoms of burnout. Emotionally, burnout hits our sense of professional identity. It manifests as a persistent sense of failure, knowing self-doubt, loss of clinical empathy, and overwhelming feeling of being trapped or helpless in our roles. For example, you might look at your schedule for the day and you see a complex client who genuinely needs your help. But instead of feeling prepared, you feel an intense wave of dread or unsettling thought. You might feel that I have absolutely nothing left for this person. Cognitively, burnout actively disrupts executive functioning. It shows up as a brain fog, working memory deficits, difficulty processing complex information, and a distinct lack of mental agility or focus. For instance, you might find yourself reading the same sentence again and again until you finally grasp it, struggling to recall clinical details during handoff and experiencing frustrating mental blocks. Behaviorally, burnout shows up as avoidance. It looks like clinical procrastination, pushing back documentation, dragging your feet to return calls, social isolation from your colleagues, and relying on passive coping mechanisms like mindless scrolling just to detach. For example, you find yourself sitting at your desk, with your client's file open or your emails open, staring at 3 urgent messages from your colleagues or clients, but instead of replying, you close the window, check your phone, and delay them until absolutely last moment. Because even this micro effort feels like too much effort from you. And physically and somatically, you might struggle with non-restorative sleep, low-grade tension headaches, constant knot in your stomach, and immune system that catches every bug going around. For example, you might finally get a full weekend off, and after weeks of working overtime, you might even sleep for 9 hours and still wake up with your shoulders hunched towards your ears, your jaw being clenched, and deep physical heaviness that weekend rest just didn't seem to fix. And what makes burnout particularly challenging clinically is that these symptoms do not appear all at once. They tend to build progressively over time. And that progression is often subtle enough that people adapt to each stage while it's happening. So let's take a look at 5 stages of burnout. The first stage is the honeymoon phase. It starts with a high ambition, perfectionism, and deep professional alignment. You're not yet struggling. You are thriving. Performance is exceptionally high. You are eagerly taking on more responsibility and push past initial fatigue because the drive overrides it. Because you look and feel successful, the earliest warning signs are entirely invisible. The second stage is the onset of stress. This is when the initial momentum fades and work stops feeling as effortless. It is marked by subtle friction, replaying client sessions late at night, shorter fuse over minor logistical issues, and growing inability to mentally switch off after hours. The demands are still being met, but your recovery officially starts to lag behind the strain. The next stage, the third stage, is chronic stress. Here, stress shifts from occasional visit to your baseline state, and you start experiencing emotional detachment during interactions that used to feel deeply meaningful. You withdraw from your colleagues, and you notice a critical shift. Even after a weekend away, you return to your desk and you might feel completely depleted. The exhaustion is no longer something you can bounce back from. It is constant. The fourth stage is a burnout itself. At this point, you hit a wall where symptoms can no longer be overridden by willpower. Your nervous system has been running on a survival mode for too long, and executive function begins to crack. This is a classic triad: profound emotional numbness, pervasive sense of hopelessness, and distinct physical or behavioral withdrawal. You are no longer functioning as yourself. The last stage is habitual burnout. In this final phase, burnout embeds itself into personality and lifestyle. The depletion completely overflows your professional boundaries, actively corroding your personal relationships, physical health, and your core identity. You no longer feel like a capable professional who is having a stressful month. You feel persistently and chronically altered. So usually, by the time someone realizes that they're in crisis, they have already been marooned in the chronic stress of burnout phase for months. So looking at this continuum, I want to ask you a question. Have you found yourself stepping into any of these latest three stages? And if you have, when exactly did the depletion become your baseline? As before, you can just simply give us a reaction or answer with an emoji. So when we look at this progression, the natural question is, when are we the most vulnerable? And it's easy to assume that burnout is a late career tax paid after decades of heavy clinical work. But the empirical data shows us the exact opposite. APA practitioners' data from 2021 to 2023 reveals that early career psychologists from internships through the 5 to 7 years to mid-career practitioners face absolute highest risk. They are the ones who are juggling extreme workload cases, rigid agency metrics, and high-strain caseloads with zero control. Risk only drops later because senior clinicians gain more autonomy to handpick their own clients, to set their hours, and to protect their boundaries. But the real warning sign goes even further. 18-year longitudinal study traced this to our university days. Student patterns of social withdrawal, self-handicapping, low optimism during training directly predicted early career burnout. So the vulnerability is often running in the background before our first official session even begins. And here is the ultimate paradox of our profession. A 2023 review analyzing 15 studies on psychologist burnout found that the most effective clinical intervention for a psychologist who has already reached burnout is largely unclear. Some tools like mindfulness, acceptance commitment therapy tools, or structured self-care programs can pull double duty for both prevention and active distress reduction. But once you hit deep clinical burnout, the road back is profound blind spot in our literature. It means that for us and for everyone, waiting until we break is a losing strategy. So once we identify where we sit on the continuum of depletion, a critical question arises. How do we know if this is actually burnout and not depression or state of chronic anxiety and stress or even trauma? So let's start by differentiating a heavy caseload with a system failure. Stress is still over-engagement. It's a high alert state where we still remain tethered to our work, driven by the belief that demands are finite. Burnout is the opposite. It is what happens when the stress isn't managed and hyperactivation just dies out. You hit a wall of emotional flatness where you've got nothing left to give. And once that happens, we need to map the context to differentiate burnout from depression. Since burnout is a role-specific cynicism, depletion, and exhaustion, and it is anchored to the office or the work. Depression, on the other hand, is pervasive, meaning that it is a globalized anhedonia that cross-cuts every domain of our life, from home, leisure, relationship, regardless of our work. So moving beyond mood and reach, we must then look at our nervous system signature to untangle burnout from anxiety. Anxiety is about hyperarousal, the threat bias that keeps you vibrating with worry even when you're off the clock. Whereas burnout is more about depletion. It is defined by a psychological wall of detachment, and you might feel structurally empty. If your dread and avoidance persist in a low demand, non clinical context, the pathology has likely generalized into anxiety or anxiety disorder, maybe. Why do they all overlap so much? Because it is a pipeline. Research shows that workplace toxicity doesn't lead directly to depression in a vacuum. Instead, it uses burnout and anxiety as a bridge. The constant friction of our work triggers a fight or flight response, and it slowly drains our resilience until the system collapses and eventually tips you into a depressive episode. And this exactly explains why some of us crash much faster than others under the same load. If you naturally tend to see uncertainty as a threat, uh, your system is running hot by default. This boils down to trait of anxiety. That constant vigilance acts as a physical accelerator. It burns your fuel and makes the distance between rapid and total breakdown much shorter. And finally, we must look at the hard data that forces us to change our approach to this workforce crisis. Systemic review across studies shows that 26% of psychologists meet criteria for burnout, coexisting with 11% of depression and 10% of anxiety. And even though these experiences overlap clinically, underlying patterns still differ. Stress is more associated with overactivation. Anxiety is more associated with fear, anticipation, and hyperarousal. And depression involves broader disturbance in mood, motivation, pleasure, and functioning. And burnout strongly associated with chronic depletion related to prolonged occupational or caregiving strain. And in practice, many individuals might experience a combination of all these symptoms at once. And now let's take a look at the psychological dimensions and theories of burnout. The job demand resources model proposes that burnout emerges when demands, the trauma exposure, and the emotional labor, the sheer volume of cases consistently outpace your organizational and cognitive capacity to process them. The real damage happens in the gap between those demands and your support. When autonomy is replaced by compliance and supervision is replaced by silence, the clinic stops being a professional space and becomes a psychological threat. You can sustain immense pressure, but only if resources are there to catch you. Without balance, collapse is inevitable. Meanwhile, the hopeful conservation of resources theory helps explain what happens next. As people, we are all managing finite reserve of resources. Burnout is a point that the reserve stops replenishing and you're spending more than what you're taking in. This then leads us to what we call loss spiral. As your reserves hit critical levels, you lose the very executive function that you need to initiate your own recovery. And it's a locked system. The more depleted you become, the harder it is for you to recover. And this would mean that you've lost the most critical tool in your toolkit, and that is your ability to regulate yourself. So Maslow and Leiter's model shifts our focus to individual capacity from individual capacity to the environment. Burnout here is a chronic mismatch between the person and their workplace. They pinpointed 6 fault lines. It's workload, control, reward, community, fairness, and values. When these misalign, such as having high responsibility with zero autonomy or carrying heavy clinical load in an environment that no longer shares your values, burnout becomes a structural outcome. The ICD-11 formalizes this through three specific dimensions: emotional exhaustion, cynicism, reduced professional efficacy. Think of this as a diagnostic markers of a failing system. From emotional exhaustion, this is the progressive depletion of your entire operating system. It's a state of being emotionally drained that rest can no longer function as a reset. Next, cynicism or mental distancing. Sometimes we treat this as a defensive coping mechanism. You withdraw, detach, and stop feeling because your system is simply trying to protect itself from a further overload. And finally, the reduced professional efficacy. Burnout eventually hits your sense of purpose. You lose your belief in your competence, the meaning of your work, and your actual effectiveness as a clinician. The work stays the same, but your capacity to engage with it simply dissolves. So let's take a moment now and to review what we have covered up until this point. In this first part, we moved beyond the baseline cost of caring to address professional reality. We are working in systems where demands constant output while offering very little to replenish it. We analyze how high-stake clinical loads, when divorced from adequate support, force our nervous system into predictable decline. But distinguishing this from general anxiety, depression, and chronic stress, we also clarified that our fatigue is not a deficit of our resilience, but a structural consequence of our environment. And we now also have the clinical framework to identify these patterns early, the diagnostic tools to measure them, and the professional mandate to stop waiting for a crisis to change our baseline. And up until this point, we examined burnout mainly through psychological and behavioral lens, but burnout is not just understood through those systems. Chronic stress is a systemic biological event that fundamentally alters how our bodies function and recover. And now we are going to take a look at biological, cognitive, somatic, and functional aspects of burnout. We are going to start with our HPA axis. HPA is our body's primary stress thermostat. Under relentless pressure, the system does not merely run high, it begins to malfunction. It becomes erratic, producing cortisol at inappropriate times or failing to respond when necessary. This explains the paradox that so many of us experiencing, feeling profound exhaustion while remaining physiologically unable to reset or rest. This eventually shifts our neurobiology. Chronic stress increases amygdala activation, heightened emotional reactivity, while dampening the efficiency of prefrontal cortex functioning, which governs our logic and focus. Cognitively, it manifests as a deficit in attention, memory, and processing speed. When we are experiencing this, we may fear we are losing our clinical edge. In reality, we are operating with a cognitive system that has depleted our functional capacity. Finally, unreleased stress anchors in the body. It manifests as a chronic tension, gastrointestinal issues, defensive muscular bracing that we carry into every session. Here, burnout is no longer a concept. It is a physical weight that impacts on our capacity to perform. Because we are trained to prioritize others, our bodies eventually start to speak for us. And it is shown in the process of somatization. Our nervous system bypasses the mind to manifest a physical injury. When we ignore the need to recover, biology forces a response through chronic pain, inflammation, or persistent fatigue. The clinical data confirms this from systematic reality. 2025 study of emergency nurses found that over 50% reported moderate to severe somatic symptoms directly correlated with burnout, regardless of shift patterns, income, or years of experience. whether manifesting is musculoskeletal disorder, cardiovascular strain, or gastrointestinal issues. These physical complaints are the direct result of a dysregulated stress system. When these boundaries fail, the impact in our work is twofold. First one is presenteeism. We continue to practice while operating well below the baseline. And second, absenteeism. The eventual inevitable withdrawal when we can no longer sustain the load. Clinically, research shows that presenteeism is a leading indicator. We are often practicing at a compromised capacity long before the system forces us to stop. This is a direct driver of clinical error and decay of our therapeutic efficacy. So now, if this crash is a predictable human response to chronic stress, why are we, as a helping professionals, so uniquely targeted? Let's take a look at the risk factors for burnout. Risk number one, we use our own humanity as a primary clinical tool. This constant demand for empathy, emotional availability, reflection creates a structural gap. Our most effective asset is the one that is we are forced to tax until it is empty, with almost no opportunity for emotional reciprocity. We carry massive responsibility for our clients' safety outcomes, and yet we operate with very little control over the system, like fundings or waiting lists that often govern our work. And the crushing administrative burden, and we are left in the landscape with no off switch. We have as well, we operate often in professional isolation, and professional isolation and the lingering stigma against admitting distress prevent early help seeking. We are trained to hold space for everyone else, but we often lack the peer support or the permission to acknowledge when our own capacity is failing. The next one is our training is prioritizing self-sacrifice and rigid internal standards, making perfectionism liability. We learn to be flawless clinicians, and yet we receive almost no guidance on building sustainable business practices or setting necessary professional boundaries. And of course, boundaries are important mechanism, yet we break them through micro breaches. For example, we are checking our emails late at night or mentally rehearsing our cases during personal time. The small cracks prevent our nervous system from ever receiving a signal that work has finished, blocking the physiological reset that we so desperately need. And of course, since the pandemic, the line between office and home collapsed, and this shift to remote practice, marked by 43% of psychologists now carrying larger work cases since 2019. And it has erased the commute, leaving us in a state of almost always being available. Our private spaces have become sites of professional demand, fueling burnout rates that peaked at 86% at the height of the crisis. And another factor is the physical nature of our work. Our role is inherently sedentary, with so many practitioners sitting for over 9 hours a day. And this creates biological bottleneck where stress hormones remain trapped, effectively anchoring our professional tension in our physical bodies. And as helping professionals, we carry unique emotional burden. While many factors contribute to burnout, the true tipping point happens when environmental pressure meets physiological or psychological core, where our greatest professional asset, our capacity to care, becomes the very tool being depleted by our work. And come to think of it, how much more heavier do you think this burden becomes when your work requires you to hold space for others' pain? And now let's take a moment and talk about psychological burden of helping professionals. The most vulnerable professionals are really the ones who are struggling visibly. They are the high performers, and we are conditioned to solve, absorb, and stay composed. because our external competence remains pristine while our internal batteries drain. And the burnout becomes invisible until the system completely stops compensating. So how do we maintain this mask? The currency is emotional labor, the exhausting constant effort of projecting calm and empathy while feeling internally depleted. Each time you suppress your own strain to prioritize the client, you pay heavy psychological premium. The debt is quiet, but it always comes due. We talk a lot about burnout and exhaustion, but one thing that we don't discuss enough in our field is vicarious trauma. This goes far deeper than emotional depletion. Repeatedly absorbing traumatic material actively alters our internal cognitive schemas. Over time, it erodes our baseline assumption about safety, trust, relational predictability, and the world itself. Research by Karademas demonstrates that even brief, acute exposure to images of human suffering immediately shifts individual cognitive schemas, making them feel significantly more vulnerable, more anxious about their own health, and less in control of their environment. Chronic exposure eventually calibrates your nervous system for survival. You might become hypervigilant, instinctively scanning the world for danger and anticipating negative outcomes, even in neutral interactions. And when this erosion leaves us with no remaining capacity to process, we hit compassion fatigue. This is one of the most profound secondary exhaustion of our ability to relate. And it doesn't mean that you lose your desire to care. You have simply bankrupted the psychological capital required to extend that care effectively. We are going to take a moment just to review briefly what we covered during our second section. And across this section, we moved from the biology of burnout to the psychological toll of clinical practice. We first identified how chronic stress physically dysregulates the body, triggering somatization and forcing the shift towards a survival-based nervous system. And we examined as well unique risk factors inherent to our field, especially how our reliance and self-sacrifice and emotional labor turns our own empathy into depleting asset. And finally, we traced the descent from professional burnout into deeper structural damage of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. The state where your capacity to care is not lost, but has become entirely bankrupt by the persistent, uncompensated demands of your work. And this mechanism make complete sense conceptually, but they become much easier to recognize when we step out and look at how does it actually manifest in our lives. And for the next few minutes, I want us to reflect on two cases. The first one is Daniel. He's 48-year-old trauma psychologist working in a crisis and suicide risk services. And he already carried several underlying vulnerabilities, prior history of depression, chronic overwork, and strong tendency to internalize responsibility for clients' outcomes. Over several years, the cumulative exposure to suicide assessments, trauma disclosure, and crisis interventions began reshaping his functioning. He stopped sleeping properly after difficult cases, replayed client conversations late at night, and withdrew socially and spent most weekends emotionally numb and physically exhausted. Colleagues noticed that he was becoming flatter, quieter, and more detached in supervision and team discussions. But Daniel continued his work, canceling leave and pushing himself even harder. Then, following a client's suicide, his functioning deteriorated rapidly. The hopelessness, emotional shutdown, and exhaustion had been that had been building over the years escalated into active suicidal behavior of his own. And for a moment now, let's step away and take a look at Sarah. She is 35-year-old early career psychologist, balancing therapy work and research and supervision and teaching responsibilities. Sarah became known for being highly competent, empathetic, and constantly available. She over-prepared for her sessions, answered emails late at night, and rarely declined additional responsibilities because slowing down triggered intense guilt and inadequacy. Over time, she has noticed an important shift in her attitude and behavior. She was dreading intake notifications, feeling exhausted before sessions even began, and quietly hoping clients would cancel, and needing increasing amounts of isolation after work just to feel mentally settled again. Externally, she still looked highly functional, but the exhaustion was becoming progressively harder to contain for her. So the stories of Daniel and Sarah shatter the myth that burnout is always a performance issue. The reality of burnout does not always look like a breakdown. While some systems collapse visibly, others double down. If we look only for struggling clinicians, we miss those who maintain their performance through self-sacrifice. They appear to be productive, but their internal capacity is quietly steadily evaporating. We must now pivot from the simple recognition to targeted action. We have to identify the risk underneath the behavior. Some colleagues need immediate stabilization to survive, while others need proactive prevention before the damage becomes irreversible. Let's take a look now at the crisis intervention and prevention. Our strategy is based by the system's capacity. Prevention is our adaptive toolset. Use this when professional is still on, but the internal battery is failing. We intervene to reinforce boundaries and to restore regulation before the integrity of their work is lost. And crisis intervention is our decompensated toolset. This is when our system is offline, when cognitive impairment and physiological distress have superseded professional capacity. The priority shifts instantly from productivity to safety. And let's map this to our cases. Daniel requires crisis intervention. His suicidal ideation marks a total systemic bypass. If we don't coach Daniel, we stabilize him. This means immediate removal from clinical responsibility and urgent medical support. Sarah requires prevention. We don't wait for her to crash. We intervene now, structuring her intake, mandating recovery, and regulating her load to stop depletion before it becomes a crisis. However, we also need to diverge from the binary. Prevention and intervention are on a fluid continuum. Many of the tools that we use for treatment, like boundary setting, stress management, the same tools we use to prevent burnout. In daily practice, we don't just choose one or another, we weave them into clinical workflow to manage nervous system's capacity. To shift from burnout management into burnout prevention, we need intervention that works at the level where strain actually accumulates. On the screen, there are several evidence-informed approaches that we can start implementing. We can use acceptance and commitment therapy process, such as cognitive diffusions and values-based actions to reduce experiential avoidance and rigid overfunctioning patterns linked to emotional exhaustion. And we implement brief interoception awareness practices to improve early detection of warning signs before escalation into burnout. We use paced breathing, grounding, and orienting exercises immediately post-session to downregulate arousal and reduce carryover between clients. But individual regulation is not enough without structural protection around the work itself. One of the strongest protective factors is preserving the reset space between high-intensity sessions instead of stacking cognitive and emotional load continuously. It is also important as well to monitor overall caseload composition. At the same time, reflective or regulatory supervision becomes critical to emotional support processing, reflective functioning, and vicarious trauma containment. Sustainable systems also require predefined intervention points. Peer cultures that normalize conversations around vicarious trauma and occupational strain improve early recognition of overload. More intentional scheduling is required, and persistent dread, insomnia, emotional withdrawal, and reduced recovery capacity needs to be treated as early indicators of workload adjustment. So once we understand the mechanism driving burnout, the next step is building a system that protects long-term capacity, not just improving our ability to endure chronic strain. With that in mind, let's move into several sustainability strategies. For this part, we can effectively utilize the Essential Network 10 developed by the Black Dog Institute. The evidence-based CBT ACT frameworks provides us with digital structure and peer support pathways specifically required for clinical sustainability. The strategies are as follows. Enforce 30-minute recovery buffers that treat personal space with the same authority as a client's appointments. Use CBT to deconstruct perfectionism and ACT to practice cognitive diffusion, disengage from the always available narrative. Codify your boundaries, define intake criteria and after-hours protocols. If you don't define them, your caseload will. Regular audit your work against your why. If it is misaligned, pivot one aspect of your role to restore the meaning. Stop reacting to depletion. Use the APS inventory to schedule physical, social, and psychological maintenance as a non-negotiable appointments. These strategies are not luxuries for helping professionals. They are our safety protocols. We don't practice self-care, but we are building a standard of our professional existence. As we are coming to an end, as we are wrapping up, I want to bring one final critical reality into focus. Burnout doesn't just live in our mind, it lives in our body. So standard talk therapy often misses the mark because burnout itself in the nervous system in a way that words cannot access alone. Because burnout stores itself in the nervous system in ways words alone cannot access. That is why we're seeing a shift towards somatic practices, breath work, yoga, movement-based therapies, and in our 5-day training, we integrate somatic attunement and movement practices because sometimes it is the only way to release the weight of this work is to move through it. And even small movements matter. A series of small physiological shifts, the intentional pause between sessions, longer, deeper exhale, or conscious act of reconnecting with your own presence, it is the repeated moment of regulation, practiced daily, that actually rebuilds your resilience. And ultimately, managing burnout is more than just about than just checking the symptoms. It is about preserving your humanity for a long haul. It's about protecting your cognitive flexibility, your ability to remain present for those who need you, and your capacity to do this deeply demanding work without losing yourself in the process. And to formally close this session, I want you to remember that you cannot pour from an empty cup. We are experts at intellectualizing distress. But to rewire a nervous system stuck in a survival mode, we need completely different environment that signals safety. We designed the upcoming 5-day training. And just to be clear, this is not designed as a wellness escape or just a passive retreat. It is an intensive clinical training designed specifically for you. We are going to dive significantly deeper in the areas that we couldn't cover today, such as burnout models, assessment tools, advanced case formulation, differential diagnosis, and broader systemic and cultural factors influencing burnout risk. And we are going to move beyond theory alone. Interesting and my favorite part of the immersion focuses on somatic integration, dance movement-based practices, experiential approaches that helps us to reconnect with the body, to help the body to feel safe, activate recovery and regulation again. Our strategies will also include work drawn from approaches such as narrative therapy and compassion-focused therapy and others. So the goal is that you live not only with information, but with practical systems that you can actually integrate into your life and work. And this includes designing your own burnout prevention plan, practical regulation-based tools, applied exercises for clinical work, and hopefully something equally as important, stronger sense of connection and support with your own profession. We also have follow-up sessions at 1 month and 6 months, so you don't have to navigate this transition on your own. Ultimately, we have to treat our own longevity with the same clinical rigor we bring to our patients. If you choose to join us, the 5-day holistic recharge training is fully inclusive of your 20-hour CPD certification, all course materials, somatic worksheets, your personal prevention plan, all-inclusive dining, and dedicated restorative sessions, available activities as well. They'll all be available to you during this period. The early bird registration window is closing shortly, and we would love to have you there. You can scan the QR code or email us if you have any questions and interested in this training. I would love to thank you once again for your time today and for joining us. And we will be sending out shortly a questionnaire and evaluation form. And once you complete it and send it back to us, we are going to send you your certification. So let's make sure that we are protecting the person that holds space for others. Thank you once again, and I will see you next time.
That concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining us and for being part of today's session. Your certificate of completion will be issued within 24 hours. The on-demand recording will be available within 24 to 48 hours and will remain accessible for 12 months. Thank you again for your time, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.